7 million barrels a day. 7% of every drop of oil the planet uses, stabilized, dried, and cleaned in the same industrial complex sitting in the middle of the Saudi desert. One site, one set of towers, one choke point almost nobody outside the industry can name. Its name is Abqaiq, and for the past 6 weeks, Iranian drones have been flying straight at it. On March 2nd, 2 drones were intercepted over the Ras Tanura refinery, the largest in the kingdom. Debris fell into the plant, a fire broke out, production stopped for 11 days. On March 12th, Saudi air defenses shot down 24 more drones over the empty quarter, some aimed at the Sheba field, others at the eastern province. On April 8th, just hours after Washington and Tehran announced a fragile ceasefire, a drone hit a pumping station on the east-west pipeline. 700,000 barrels a day, gone overnight. This is not a hypothetical. It is a slow-motion war on the single piece of infrastructure that keeps the global economy breathing, and it is being fought with machines that cost less than a used car. Brent crude is trading around $112. Gasoline has crossed $4 a gallon in the United States. And the question sitting on every oil trader's desk is no longer, will Saudi oil be hit? It is, how much more can it take before the next Abqaiq? What we are going to look at today is the architecture of that vulnerability. Why Saudi oil is built around a handful of irreplaceable sites. Why $15 billion of American air defense did not stop cheap Iranian drones. And what it means for the price you pay at the pump, in the supermarket, and inside your portfolio over the next 12 months. Before we dive in, take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button. It is free, it helps the channel, and it keeps this kind of deep analysis coming. Welcome to Money Radar. To understand what is happening right now, you have to understand how Saudi oil actually works. And it works in a way most people would find genuinely shocking. When we think of oil production, we imagine a forest of pump jacks, a spiderweb of wells, a decentralized system where losing one piece barely matters. That picture is true for the United States. It is not true for Saudi Arabia. The kingdom's model is the opposite. It is concentration. It is centralization. It is efficiency at the cost of resilience. At the top of that pyramid sits Abqaiq, the world's largest crude oil processing and stabilization plant. 7 million barrels of daily capacity, 18 stabilization towers, gas oil separation trains that remove hydrogen sulfide and volatile compounds before the oil can be shipped anywhere. If Abqaiq stops, the oil still in the ground might as well stay there. Nothing is exportable without being processed. And Abqaiq is not some hardened bunker. It is an industrial site in the open desert, visible from space, with known coordinates published in public energy reports for decades. Every engineer in the oil world knows exactly what a tower looks like, exactly which ones matter, and exactly how long it takes to replace one. Below Abqaiq, the rest of the system is just as concentrated. Ras Tanura on the Gulf Coast handles around 3.4 million barrels a day of exports, making it the world's largest offshore loading facility. The east-west pipeline, nicknamed Petroline, runs 1,200 kilometers across the kingdom to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Its full capacity is 7 million barrels a day. That pipeline is the only serious escape route if the Strait of Hormuz closes, which, as of mid-April, it has. Iran declared the strait effectively shut on March 27th, and a 2-week ceasefire has not changed that fact on the water. So you have 3 physical assets, Abqaiq, Ras Tanura, Petroline, that together represent the backbone of 15% of global crude supply. A small number of towers, a handful of pump stations, and one long pipeline. Hit any of them hard enough and the whole kingdom's export capacity falls off a cliff. The Saudis know this. They have known it since at least September 2019, because there was a warning, a very loud one. On September 14th of that year, a coordinated strike of cruise missiles and drones hit Abqaiq and the nearby Khurais field. 14 storage tanks were punctured. 3 oil processing trains were disabled. 5 of the 18 stabilization towers took direct impacts. Saudi output dropped from 9.8 million barrels a day to 4.1 million. In a single night, 5.7 million barrels, more than half of Saudi production and roughly 5% of global supply, disappeared. Brent jumped 20%, the biggest one-day move since the 1990 invasion of Kuwait. An Israeli military expert called it a Pearl Harbor for the oil industry. The lesson was simple. Low-altitude drones, flying under the engagement ceiling of Patriot missiles, could paralyze the kingdom's entire export machine in minutes. 7 years later, that lesson has been cashed in. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable for anyone who still believes money buys security. Saudi Arabia has spent the last decade assembling one of the most expensive air defense networks on Earth. A $15 billion foreign military sale signed with Washington in 2017, covering 7 THAAD batteries, 44 launchers, 360 interceptors, plus Patriot PAC-3 systems already in place. On paper, an impenetrable shield. On paper. The first Saudi THAAD battery only became operational in July 2025, a full 8 years after the order. And when the Iran war started on February 28th of this year, the kingdom entered the fight with a half-built roof over its head. Every incoming wave tells the same story. On March 1st, ballistic missiles targeted Prince Sultan Air Base and Riyadh Airport. 1 American soldier died from his injuries. On March 2nd, 2 drones reached Ras Tanura. On March 3rd, drones struck the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh itself. On March 14th, 5 American refueling planes were damaged on the tarmac at Prince Sultan. On March 27th, a ballistic strike destroyed a Boeing E-3 Sentry and damaged a KC-135 tanker. 29 U.S. service members wounded in one strike. Drones keep reaching Saudi territory. Some are intercepted, some are not. The Saudi Defense Ministry counts every shootdown as a win, but the math of attrition does not work that way. A THAAD interceptor costs roughly $11 million. A Patriot PAC-3 runs around $4 million. The Shahed 136 drone Iran has been firing by the hundreds costs between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit. You do not need to hit anything to win this math war. You just need the defender to keep firing. And eventually, the defender runs out of interceptors, or radars, or nerve. One CSIS analyst put it bluntly: drone swarms serve 2 functions at once: saturation, to empty the magazines, and targeted strikes on the radar infrastructure that makes interception possible. Destroy a single THAAD radar, and you render useless $500 million or more of interceptors that can no longer find their targets. The April 8th East-West pipeline hit is the cleanest example of how this plays out in practice. Hours after an official ceasefire had been announced, a drone reached a pump station. 700,000 barrels a day of throughput lost. Manifa Field, 300,000 barrels damaged. Karais, another 300,000 barrels damaged. 1 Saudi security worker killed, 7 injured. Aramco reported a 20% cut in total output. That is not an operational hiccup. That is the largest operational crisis in the company's history, in its own words. The pipeline was back at full capacity 4 days later, on April 12th. Saudi engineers are genuinely among the best in the world, and the repair speed proves it. But speed of repair is not the same thing as safety. Every time a plant is rebuilt, the next drone flight simply breaks it again. The only thing that has prevented a true Abqaiq 2 so far is a combination of interception, luck, and the fact that Iran has calibrated its strikes to avoid total war. And there is a second layer most analysts underweight. The strikes we see in the news are the obvious ones. What the public rarely hears about are the cyber operations hitting Aramco's control systems in parallel. Saudi Aramco has been a prime cyber target since the 2012 Shamoon malware wiped 30,000 computers inside the company in a single weekend. The physical drones and the digital intrusions work as a single pressure campaign. Shut down a pump remotely, break a tower with a warhead, and force the defender to fight on 2 fronts with 1 budget. That is the real playbook. That calibration can change at any moment, and the markets know it. Brent crude went from $72 on February 27th to 112 by late March, a 55% move in less than a month. It touched 126 at its peak after the Strait of Hormuz was declared shut. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest coordinated drawdown in its history, larger even than the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At current global consumption of 105 million barrels a day, that reserve covers roughly 4 days of world demand. One analyst described it as a small bandage on a very large wound. The wound is the geography itself, and geography does not heal. Let's bring this home. Because while the map of attacks is thousands of miles away, the consequences have already crossed every border and landed in places most people do not even associate with the Persian Gulf. Start with the pump. In late March, the average US gasoline price crossed $4 a gallon for the first time since late 2023. In Europe, the pain is worse. Dutch TTF natural gas benchmarks nearly doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour because 20% of global LNG was moving through the Strait of Hormuz when Qatar declared force majeure on its long-term contracts. The Ras Laffan LNG complex in Qatar, described as the engine of the country's growth, suffered damage projected to take 3 to 5 years to repair. 17% of Qatari LNG capacity offline all at once. Then there is food. Food does not seem connected to oil until you remember fertilizer is made from natural gas, and ships carrying food across the world burn diesel. 70% of Gulf region food imports were disrupted by mid-March. Fertilizer prices jumped 40%. In some importing countries, food prices rose 40 to 120% for consumers. Inside Iran itself, food inflation has surged to 105%, with bread up 140% and cooking oil up more than 200% year on year. The financial system felt it too. The 10-year U.S. Treasury yield jumped to 4.46%. The 30-year mortgage rate climbed to 6.38%. Asian markets took a brutal hit. South Korea's Kospi dropped 12% in its worst sell-off since 2008. Pakistan's KSE 100 lost a stunning 16,000 points. The UN Development Program put the cost to Arab economies alone at between $120 and $194 billion in lost GDP. For the European investor watching from Paris, London, or Frankfurt, the transmission is direct. The euro is exposed to Gulf energy imports. European industry runs on natural gas. UK inflation is now forecast to breach 5% in 2026, just as most central banks were hoping to cut rates. Every extra week of disruption pushes the rate cut cycle further out, pushes mortgage costs higher, and squeezes household budgets that were already stretched from the 2022 energy shock. A shock, by the way, the global economy never fully digested. And then there is Saudi Arabia itself. Vision 2030, the Crown Prince's $2.5 trillion bet to transform the kingdom into something other than a petrostate, is now openly in crisis. The line, the 170-kilometer mirrored city, was already suspended in late 2024. Foreign direct investment into the kingdom is forecast to fall 60 to 70% in the first quarter compared to last year. Luxury hotel bookings dropped 45% in the first 2 weeks of March. When the story you sell the world is come invest, come visit, come build the future, and the reality is drones flying over your oil plants, the story stops selling. Riyadh has responded by pivoting hard. Aramco ramped up exports through Yanbu on the Red Sea before the crisis, taking pipeline loadings from 750,000 barrels a day to roughly 2.5 million, with a target of 7 million within weeks. OPEC agreed to a modest 206,000 barrel a day production increase, but the organization's total March output collapsed by nearly 8 million barrels a day to 20.79 million, the steepest monthly drop in the data series going back to the 1980s. You cannot raise production with plants you have shut down. The spare capacity conversation used to be theoretical. Traders and analysts would debate whether Saudi Arabia really held 3 or 4 million barrels of unused capacity in reserve, ready to deploy if the market needed it. That debate is now over. Spare capacity only matters if you can move the oil. With the Strait of Hormuz still closed to ships going to or from US and Israeli allied ports, the only functional bypass is the East-West pipeline, the same pipeline Iran hit 3 days before it was supposed to be the savior. So here is what the 6 weeks from February 28th to mid-April have actually revealed. Saudi oil is not an armored, untouchable fortress. It is an extraordinarily efficient, extraordinarily centralized, and extraordinarily exposed system. A system that works brilliantly in peace and cracks visibly in war. A system where a $300 Iranian drone can force an $11 million interceptor out of a tube and still get through enough of the time to matter. The kingdom has survived this first round. The East-West pipeline is pumping again. Ras Tanura has restarted. Damage has been contained, casualties have been limited, and on paper the ceasefire still holds. But the architecture is unchanged. Abqaiq is still Abqaiq. Ras Tanura is still Ras Tanura. The Strait of Hormuz is still a 21-mile choke for a fifth of the world's oil. And the drones that flew across it are still in Iran's arsenal. What should stay with you is not the image of a single attack. It is the image of a new equilibrium. A world where the price of oil carries a permanent geopolitical tax, measured by some analysts at $40 a barrel over fundamentals. A world where energy security is no longer a chapter in a textbook, but a line in your electricity bill. A world where, for perhaps the first time since the 1973 embargo, the real bottleneck in the global economy is a specific set of industrial buildings you could walk around in an afternoon. The Saudis will rebuild. The Americans will send more interceptors. The markets will normalize some of the premium, and headlines will drift elsewhere. But the asymmetry is out of the bottle. A handful of towers in the desert, and a handful of drones flying low enough to reach them, now decide what you pay for gasoline in your own city, whether your grocery bill keeps rising, and whether the central bank cutting rates next quarter feels like a relief or a rumor. One question remains, and it is the one worth sitting with. If the backbone of global energy turns out to be this fragile, and this hard to defend even with $15 billion of American hardware, then who really holds the leverage the next time Tehran picks up the phone? The country that owns the oil? Or the country that can stop it from moving?